Hey everyone, there's been a lot of interest in the filter feeding shrimp that I keep and the short videos I've shared of them recently. As well, I've kind of gotten a request for a species spotlight to provide some more info, and so I figured I'd put this together as something to share with y'all. The scientific name for them is Atyopsis Moluccensis, but they are commonly more referred to as bamboo, flower, wood, or Singapore shrimp, and there's also many other names that they're known by. They are from Southeast Asia, and generally they're found on islands that are called high islands with some elevation above sea level, such as Okinawa, Sri Lanka, Samoa, and many other islands. Size wise, they tend to be available in the hobby starting around half-inch size roughly, and will grow up to a maximum length of around 2 to 3 inches. The generally accepted lifespan for them is roughly 1 to 2 years if you kept them in a suitable environment where they can be happy and thrive. They require moderate water flow movement, and they do best in the temperature ranges normal to most aquariums, roughly that 68 to 82 Fahrenheit range. But ideally, probably 74 to 78 Fahrenheit would be considered ideal. pH range of 6.5 to a bit over 8.0 is acceptable. And they appreciate, having moderate to hard water. Personally, I keep them roughly about 78 degrees Fahrenheit. My TDS coming out of the tap here is around 400, quite high. Both KH and GH being up there. My pH settles in around 7.8. And again, this is not ideal, but they're perfectly happy and they are thriving under those conditions. Generally, the thing I would probably do would be to lower the total dissolved solids to more in the 200 to 250 range, keeping the KH a bit lower. But again, I'm happy with how they're doing, and they are doing great. They enjoy perches near where water flow is happening, and that's because they're a filter feeder. They benefit from plants, rocks, and wood in their aquarium environments, not only for hiding as well as for the organics, particles, and surface area that they provide, along with the microflora and fauna that will live on them. The rocks, plants, and wood are also provide very secure places where the shrimp can retreat after molting, which they do roughly every 3 to 6 weeks. They are more vulnerable during this period of time while their new exoskeleton is hardening, and they'll feel more secure with plenty of places to cover. In regards to reproduction, they will breed in freshwater, but their young require brackish in order to develop and transform from larvae into shrimplets, much like an amano shrimp. From my research, the adults cannot survive in brackish themselves, and in nature, the young are born and swept by water flow into the lagoons where they develop, and then as shrimplets, they will travel back into the freshwater bodies from which they originally came. The males can be distinguished from the females based on size. The males are often larger, and as well, they have modified forelegs. For the males, the first set of forelegs being quite larger than the other two, and with females, all three pairs being roughly the same size. Now that we have all that info out of the way, let's turn to why people choose to keep them. While people may purchase them for many reasons, the most common and realistic one are that they thoroughly enjoy watching these animals in their natural behaviors, sitting in the flow feeding. I say realistic due to people sometimes purchasing them with grand plans on using them as a member of their cleanup crew, which, while it's not impossible, is just really not that practical in the normal sense. They do offer benefits. I do consider them a member of my cleanup crews, but I consider that a bonus, not as their base sole purpose for being in the aquarium. And I do provide food, not just hoping that they'll eat based off of what the aquarium is producing detritus wise. Now, That said, keep in mind, most hobbyist aquariums, the water coming into the tank creating flow is actually the cleanest. It's been totally scrubbed of microparticles since it's being returned after being treated by a hang-on bag, a canister filter, or a sump. Yes, the flow and movement itself dislodges some particles from that area of flow, but in general, that's not where stuff will normally settle out as particles that could then be kicked up. So it's not a generally good idea to expect that as a source of particles for them to feed on. The natural instincts for these flower shrimp is to find the flow, filter out the particles that they love so much, and then, eat them as their food. But as we just discussed, in the standard aquarium, these two things are not one and the same, and the shrimp can actually starve themselves waiting for food that will never come. We'll discuss later how to address this pressing issue in keeping them happy and healthy in the aquarium. This leads us to another feeding behavior commonly seen by these shrimp, scavenging in the substrate for detritus to feed on. As can be seen by taking a look at their mitts, or their forelegs that are modified for filtering, they have been incredibly specialized for feeding out of the water column. But all captive specimens that survive will eventually learn when food is scarce to turn to sifting substrate rather than starve. Generally, this is, due to ignorance, not people doing it on purpose. But in aquariums, generally, they're not set up to take care of these without doing some extra steps. Some people will go as far as to say that that's substrate sifting is completely unnatural for these type of shrimp and is only seen in captivity, never in the wild. Well, I've never myself viewed them in the wild. I wouldn't go that far, but I definitely would say that you need to monitor and note when you see them doing this behavior of sifting the substrate at the bottom of the tank. If you can't explain it for a reason other than lack of food, you need to address something in how you're taking care of these guys. If this is what they do the majority of the time, you need to be supplementing their food and also making sure that there's flow and other ways of them to feed. Now, with all that said, if there's a huge amount of detritus that's available for them to sift through the substrate, they will go down there and do that, even if there is food available in the water column and in the flow. But you need to, again, monitor the behavior and make sure that they aren't there because not only because it's a feast, but because they can't find food elsewhere. If that's all that they can do to feed, that's a problem. If they choose to go down there, even despite the food that you're giving them and that they feed on sometimes in the water column, then that's them just helping out with your cleanup duties and isn't a bad idea at all. That said, also, having something that will kick that food up into the water column is preferential to them sifting through for food. There's many strategies for keeping them well fed, but the simplest usually involves powdered foods, anything from spirulina to fish food. I like to use spirulina as my primary food for them. Being invertebrates, make sure to check fish foods for copper in the ingredients. Essentially, anything with a high amount of copper is a definite no-go for invertebrates. It's debatable on the small quantities. Myself, I avoid it, being as food is added cumulatively over time and will build up. Again, I feed spirulina powder. I get food grade, and every day I give a small to moderate quantity, and then twice a week roughly I'll double that with a bigger feeding. For several bamboo shrimp in the 50-gallon I have, I say my normal feeding would be about a half a teaspoon daily. And with the larger feeding, I'd say 1 to 1.5, sometimes even 2 teaspoons. In larger feedings, I generally like to also add in some powdered fish food. That could be crushed flakes, that could be granules that are put through a pepper grinder or mortar and pestle to powderize them. And I also like to add in some Bacter AE as well, though you do need to be careful first times using those. Um, Generally, though, it is a big boon to the biofilm in your aquarium and other microlife that exists. Also, other types of inverts do great from these feedings. My shrimp, I keep Neocaridina, as well as guppies, as well as plecos, as well as all the snails. They love the spirulina powder and grazing for it. Especially the babies are just go nuts for it. But everyone comes out when I do these feedings. There's also, some other more creative strategies for feeding, involving tank sourcing the detritus for them to feed on. Generally, though, you need some larger tanks, heavily planted. Um, but probably the most interesting one that I've ever heard or researched, I have no experience with myself, would be stocking roughly 9 female amanos to every 2 to 3 adult bamboo shrimp. Um, the reason for this is the female amanos will release their eggs into the freshwater, which have no chance of surviving as they need brackish to transform from larvae into shrimplets. The young, in this case, can then instead be used as feed for the bamboo shrimp. So something to look into if you have a bunch of amanos. You may want to use this as a supplement. I personally wouldn't want to just allow them to only have this as a food source, but it is interesting nonetheless. The more realistic creative strategies for feeding off of tank detritus are creating that flow in other ways, and making sure that you're not just relying on flow created by water that's been scrubbed. You can do things such as sponge filters, the standard sponge filters. While they will remove the particles, they also do create quite a bit of disruption in that area of the tank, and they will love to hang out all around them, filtering out particles. Hang-on backs will also create flow, which you can dump the spirulina powder into, or if you have chosen other tank mates such as Corydoras, plecos, things that will stir up the bottom, it will then get pulled into that water column and allow them to feed off of it. You can also use wave makers, things like that. Make sure to protect the opening so that young inverts and fish don't get sucked in, but you can have those on periodically or pointing at areas where detritus is more likely to accumulate to kick it back up. Periodic is probably a bit better, so that you can have stuff settle out more, and then periodically a wave maker would turn on to push it back up. You could also use something along the lines of an air-powered water lift that has no filtering on it. Its collection point being near the bottom of the tank where detritus is, and the release of that material and flow and air bubbles being up closer to where a water flow is happening. Again, with regards to tank mates, compatible species, they're a very peaceful shrimp. Generally, the only sort of aggression that they'll show at all is to bully their own species generally, and that's usually only for prime feeding spots. They are not aggressive, they have no claws, they have the modified forelegs, which are their filter mitts. That said, they definitely should be housed with other peaceful community species of inverts and fish. generally large cichlids, large fish that can fit them inside of their mouths, that will harass or become territorial, will pick at them, or stress them out. Generally not a good idea. Now that said, I'm sure there's people that have kept them with some fish that we would never assume would be possible to keep them, but to each their own. Your mileage is going to vary. But I generally recommend dwarf and pygmy cories, bushy nose plecos, guppies, neocaridina shrimp, and most types of snails, which generally goes well with a well-planted tank as well. The only big thing different is most of those species are generally not kept with a lot of flow, and you definitely need some flow for these to thrive. Please feel free to comment below if I forgot to cover anything or if you have any additional questions. And thanks for taking the time to watch. I hope you enjoyed the video, the pictures, the info. And please remember to like and subscribe if you're interested in more information like this. Merry Fishmas, everyone. Until next time.